Marilyn Monroe was halfway through a live interview when she did something that had never been seen in the history of television. As 20 million people watched in a vacuum of silence, the most famous woman in the world stood up, disconnected her microphone, and walked into the night, all because of 12 vicious words she was never supposed to hear. The evening had started like any other, with the faint smell of burning dust on the hot stage lights and the distant hum of the city. The streets outside the studio were lined with fans, their faces pressed against the cold glass of the lobby, hoping for just a glimpse of the woman who had become the world's living dream. Marilyn had arrived in a cloud of white silk, her hair a halo of platinum, looking every bit the goddess they expected her to be. But those who were standing in the wings that night, the stagehands, the makeup artists who had known her for years, saw something else. They saw the way her fingers trembled as she smoothed her skirt. They saw the tiny flicker of hesitation in her eyes as she looked at the empty chair on the stage. She wasn't there to be a pin-up that night. She had come to talk about her heart, about the books she was reading, and about the woman she was becoming behind the closed doors of her bungalow. Arthur Vance was the king of the midnight hour, a man whose tongue was as sharp as the crease in his trousers and whose reputation for breaking guests was legendary. Just months prior, he had reduced a young starlet to tears by mocking her accent, and tonight he had Marilyn in his crosshairs. He built his career on the art of the gotcha moment, peeling back the layers of Hollywood's elite until there was nothing left but raw nerves. As Marilyn took her seat, the warmth of her smile filled the lens, radiating into living rooms across the country where families sat huddled around their mahogany television sets. She looked radiant, but there was a fragility to her posture that suggested she was walking a tightrope. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation was a gentle dance. They laughed about the weather, about the bright lights of Broadway, and about the simple joys of a quiet New York morning. But beneath the surface, a trap was being set. Vance wasn't interested in her soul. He was interested in a headline that would cement his power. He began to steer the conversation away from her craft and toward the shadows of her past, his voice dropping into a tone that was falsely sympathetic. The audience, mostly older couples who had grown up with the stars of the Golden Age, felt the shift in their gut. It was a predatory energy, a deliberate attempt to rattle a woman who had spent her entire life trying to find a safe place to land. As the first commercial break approached, Vance leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eyes that signaled the end of the pleasantries. The man who was supposed to be her host was about to use a secret she thought she had buried forever, a betrayal that would turn the studio into a battlefield. She had spent 3 hours in the dressing room chair just to hide how much she was shaking, her hands tucked beneath a cold towel to keep the tremors from ruining her manicure. To the world, she was the invincible sun around which all of Hollywood orbited, but in the quiet of the backstage shadows, she was just a girl from the orphanage who still felt like an uninvited guest at her own party. She had meticulously practiced her answers, not to deceive, but to protect the soft parts of her spirit that were so often bruised by the harsh demands of the spotlight. This appearance on the Arthur Vance show was supposed to be her bridge to a new life, a chance to show the world that there was a brilliant, searching mind behind the famous porcelain skin. She had brought a small, green leather-bound book of poetry by Walt Whitman with her, tucked inside her silk handbag, hoping for a moment to share a single verse that had given her comfort during her loneliest nights. Marilyn truly believed that Arthur was a friend, a man who had shared private dinners with her and promised to treat her with the dignity she so desperately craved. She had trusted him with the truth that she was tired of playing the character the studios had created, and she walked onto that set with the hopeful heart of a student arriving for the first day of school. As the floor manager counted down from 5, the bright red light of the camera flickered to life like a warning. The studio audience, a sea of suits and pearls, leaned forward in anticipation of the magic they expected her to provide. Marilyn took a deep breath, her lungs filling with the scent of floor wax and expensive perfume, and offered that breathtaking smile that could stop time itself. She leaned toward Arthur, her posture graceful but guarded, unaware that the script on his desk had been rewritten since their last friendly phone call. The monitors in the control room showed a woman at the peak of her powers, but if you looked closely at the way her pulse hammered against the thin skin of her neck, you could see the truth of her vulnerability. The atmosphere in the room was electric, a mixture of adoration and a voyeuristic hunger for something more than just a polite conversation. Every time she spoke about her desire to study at the actor's studio or her love for the quiet New York libraries, a faint, mocking smirk would touch the corners of Arthur's mouth. It was a subtle cruelty, a way of telling her without words that he didn't believe she belonged in the world of the intellect. Yet, she pressed on, her voice soft and melodic, trying to maintain her poise even as the questions began to take on a sharper, more jagged edge. She was a lamb walking into a thicket of thorns, still believing that if she was kind enough and honest enough, the thorns wouldn't dare to pierce her. The trap was fully set, and as the lights grew hotter, the girl who only wanted to be understood found herself cornered by a man who had already decided to destroy her peace. Join our family of those who remember the true spirit behind the silver screen by subscribing to the channel. Because the moment the kindness in the room evaporated, a coldness took its place that would rattle every home in America. The polite mask of the interview didn't just slip, it was torn away with a suddenness that made the studio audience catch its collective breath. One moment they were discussing the bright lights of the cinema, and the next, the air in the room became thin and suffocatingly cold. Arthur Vance adjusted his tie, his eyes losing their artificial warmth, as he prepared to dismantle the dignity of the woman sitting just 3 feet away from him. It began with a subtle shift in his tone, a condescending lilt that felt like a slap disguised as a question. He stopped calling her Marilyn and began using a voice one might use for a disobedient child, mocking her marriage to the great playwright Arthur Miller. He leaned in, his shadow stretching across her white silk dress, and asked if she truly believed she could understand the complex words her husband wrote, or if she simply memorized them like a parrot. You could see the precise moment the light dimmed in her eyes. Her throat tightened, and that famous, luminous smile began to flicker like a candle in a drafty hallway. She tried to laugh it off, a soft, nervous sound that echoed through the silent studio, but Vance was relentless. He moved from her mind to her heart, poking at her insecurities with the precision of a surgeon who had forgotten his vow to do no harm. The audience, many of whom had followed her journey from the early days of black and white film, felt a knot of protective anger growing in their chests. It was painful to watch. Marilyn sat there, her back as straight as a soldier's, clutching her handbag so tightly her knuckles turned the color of ivory. She was a woman who had spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough, and here, on national television, the man she trusted was confirming her deepest fears. Vance's questions became a series of jagged edges, cutting into the hope she had brought onto the stage. He brought up her childhood, not with the compassion of a friend, but with the cold curiosity of a man examining a specimen. Every time she reached for a moment of grace, he pulled it out of her grasp, replacing it with a barb about her reputation or her perceived failings. The rhythm of the conversation had turned into a steady, rhythmic beating of a drum, each strike intended to break her spirit. Marilyn's bottom lip trembled for a fleeting second before she bit it back, her eyes shimmering with the salt of unshed tears. She looked toward the wings of the stage, perhaps searching for a friendly face or a way out, but the cameras remained locked on her face, hungry for the breakdown that Vance was so clearly trying to provoke. She was no longer a star in that moment. She was a person being stripped of her humanity for the sake of a higher rating. The studio lights, once a golden glow, now felt like a harsh, interrogating glare that left no room for her to breathe or hide. The first cut had been deep, but Arthur Vance was about to cross a line that no gentleman should ever approach. He was looking for blood, and he was about to weaponize a grief so private that even the studio crew froze in their tracks. Arthur Vance leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that the microphones caught with terrifying clarity, cutting through the heavy air like a razor through silk. The studio fell into a vacuum of sound, where even the whir of the heavy cameras seemed to freeze in anticipation. He didn't just ask a question. He reached into the most guarded corner of her soul and dragged her private grief into the harsh, artificial glare of the spotlight. The host looked directly into her shimmering eyes and brought up the nursery that sat empty in her home, the tiny clothes she had bought in secret, and the dreams that had ended before they could begin. It was a vicious turn, a cruel and calculated strike at her womanhood and the deep, maternal longing she had rarely shared with anyone but her closest confidants. The audience let out a collective gasp, a sound of pure, instinctive horror at the sight of a man dismantling a woman's heart for a bit of sensationalism. Marilyn's face went completely still, the porcelain mask finally shattering to reveal a level of raw, naked agony that was almost too much to witness. Her hand went to her throat, her fingers brushing against the pearls that now felt like a noose as the realization of his betrayal washed over her in a cold, suffocating wave. For a long, agonizing minute, she simply stared at him, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that moved the silk of her bodice. The camera operator, moved by a sudden sense of shame, tried to pull the shot back, but the director barked an order to stay close, wanting every ounce of her sorrow for the viewers at home. We saw the way her eyes searched his face for a flicker of the friend she thought she knew, only to find the cold, empty stare of a man who valued a viral moment more than a human life. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight, a mourning for the trust that had just been shattered beyond repair on national television. Mothers in living rooms from Maine to California reached for their handkerchiefs, recognizing the look of a person who had been pushed past the point of endurance. Marilyn's lip didn't tremble this time. Instead, a strange and powerful calm began to settle over her features, a quiet dignity that was more terrifying than any scream. She looked down at her hands, then back at the man who had sought to break her spirit. The air in the studio was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy weight of a tragedy in progress. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when the whole world was watching and no one offered you a hand to hold? Share your story in the comments below, for every voice of courage strengthens the rest of us. She was no longer just a starlet. She was a woman deciding that she had given enough of herself to a world that only wanted to take. The stage was set for an act of defiance that would change the rules of Hollywood forever, beginning with the exact moment she stopped being a puppet and started being a queen. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, and she didn't give him the spectacle of a breakdown. She simply stopped being Marilyn Monroe. In a single, breathtaking moment of clarity, the persona she had carefully built for a decade evaporated under the hot studio lights, leaving behind a woman of such immense, quiet power that the air in the room seemed to freeze. Arthur Vance sat with his mouth slightly agape, his scripted insults suddenly feeling like small, useless pebbles against a mountain of sudden, righteous dignity. Marilyn stood up with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded every eye in the building. There was no frantic energy in her movements, only a profound and heavy stillness that felt like the closing of a chapter. She didn't look at the cameras, and she didn't look at the thousands of people sitting in the darkness of the theater. She looked directly into the soul of the man who had tried to shame her for her sorrows. With a gentle hand, she reached out and disconnected the small silver microphone clipped to her dress, laying it down on the velvet cushion of her chair as if she were laying a fallen bird to rest. The sound of the microphone hitting the fabric was the loudest noise in the building, a dull thud that signaled the end of an era. The walkout began not with a run, but with the steady, rhythmic click of her high heels against the polished wooden floor of the stage. Each step echoed through the silence of the studio, a heartbeat of defiance that resonated in the souls of every woman watching from their sofas at home. The producer in the control booth was screaming for the cameras to cut to black. The director's hands were sweating on the panel, but the operators were mesmerized, their hands frozen on the dials as they captured the sight of a legend reclaiming her soul. She passed the band, who had stopped playing their jaunty transitions, and she passed the stagehands who stood with their hats in their hands, recognizing that they were witnessing a person finally choosing herself over her fame. As she reached the heavy, soundproof door at the edge of the set, she paused for just one heartbeat. She didn't turn around to look at the wreckage of the interview or the man who had caused it. Instead, she took a long, deep breath, the first one she had truly taken since the red light had flickered on. The smug expression on Arthur Vance's face had finally crumbled, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked realization that he hadn't just lost a guest. He had extinguished the light of his own career. He had tried to break her for the sake of entertainment, but in doing so, he had only succeeded in showing the world that her spirit was something that could never be bought or sold. The door swung shut behind her with a soft, final click, leaving the king of talk sitting in a vacuum of his own making. The audience remained in their seats, too stunned to move, as she walked out of the spotlight and into a rain-soaked alleyway where a secret encounter was waiting to offer the comfort that fame never could. The heavy iron stage door slammed shut, cutting off the frantic shouts of the producers, leaving her in the sudden, velvet embrace of a New York midnight. The rain began to fall then, not as a storm, but as a soft, cooling mist that kissed her heated skin and mingled with the salt of the tears she finally allowed to fall. In that narrow, brick-lined alleyway behind the theater, the most famous woman in the world was no longer a goddess or a tragedy. She was simply a shivering girl in a white silk dress that was quickly becoming soaked through. She leaned against the damp bricks, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline of her escape began to fade, leaving behind a hollow ache of betrayal. The city lights glowed like distant amber jewels beyond the mouth of the alley, but here in the shadows, she felt hidden for the first time in years. Then, the sound of a scuffed boot against the pavement made her start. Standing by a stack of wooden crates was a young man, barely 20 years old, wearing a grease-stained jumpsuit and holding a janitor's broom. He wasn't a reporter, and he wasn't a fan looking for a trophy. He was just a boy who had been sweeping the floors while the world watched a woman's heart get broken. He didn't rush toward her with a camera or ask for an autograph. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, albeit worn, cotton handkerchief. He took 2 hesitant steps forward and held it out, his eyes downcast in a gesture of profound respect that she hadn't felt from a man in a very long time. Marilyn took the cloth, her fingers brushing against his, and for a moment, the silence between them was more healing than any applause she had ever received. He told her softly that he had seen what happened on the monitors inside and that his mother always said a person's worth wasn't measured by the questions they were asked, but by the kindness they kept in their eyes. They stood there for several minutes, 2 strangers sharing a moment of pure, unvarnished humanity in the rain. She asked him his name, and he told her it was Tommy, and that he wanted to be a teacher one day so he could help children feel like they mattered. Marilyn smiled, a real, tired smile that reached her eyes, and told him that he was already a better teacher than the man sitting under the lights inside. In that damp, dark alley, the crushing weight of the industry and the cruelty of Arthur Vance seemed a million miles away. This was the intimate secret the cameras never captured the night a humble stagehand saved her spirit when she felt most alone. If you believe that a small act of kindness can change the course of a life, please share this story with someone who needs to know they are seen. While Marilyn drove away, the studio she left behind was descending into a different kind of chaos as the public began to dismantle the man who had tried to destroy her. Back inside the studio, the cameras were still rolling, but the man who called himself the king of late night was sitting on a throne of glass that was rapidly shattering. The red on-air light continued to glow like a taunting eye, illuminating a stage that was now haunted by the ghost of a woman's dignity. Arthur Vance sat frozen in his leather chair, his face a mask of sweating, panicked confusion as he realized that the silence following Marilyn's departure was more deafening than any standing ovation. The atmosphere in the room had turned from curiosity to a heavy, suffocating resentment. In 1959, the switchboards at the National Broadcasting Company did not just ring. They exploded in a symphony of righteous fury that lit up the building from top to bottom. Thousands of viewers, grandmothers in their rocking chairs, and veterans sitting at their kitchen tables reached for their rotary phones to demand an apology for the woman they had just seen treated with such cruelty. They didn't see a movie star walking off a set. They saw their daughters and their sisters being bullied by a man who thought his microphone gave him the right to be a god. Arthur tried to recover, his voice cracking as he attempted to make a joke about the temperamental nature of Hollywood stars, but the laughter did not come. The studio audience sat with their arms crossed, their faces turned away from him as if looking at him might leave a stain on their own character. The legendary Vance charm had curdled into something grotesque, and the sponsors were already calling the network to sever their ties. By the time the show went to its final commercial break, the man who had supposedly broken every star in the business looked like a small, hollow shell. He had aimed for a viral moment of weakness, but instead, he had provided a mirror that showed the world the ugliness of his own heart. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving, a tidal wave of public disapproval that would eventually bring an end to his time in the spotlight. The king of talk had lost his crown because he forgot that the American people cherish a person's heart even more than a scandal. As he walked off the stage that night, his footsteps didn't echo with the same strength as Marilyn's. They sounded like a retreat into a long, lonely shadow where he would remain for the rest of his life. The world had chosen its side, and it wasn't the side of the man with the microphone. But the story didn't end with the closing of the studio doors, for a secret was waiting to be discovered in a place no one thought to look. In the next chapter, we reveal the mysterious, handwritten note that proved Marilyn was never as alone as she felt that night, a message from someone who had also survived the firing squad. Years later, tucked inside a worn book of poetry found on Marilyn's nightstand, was a single, yellowed envelope that held the secret to her strength that night. It was a humble piece of stationery, the ink slightly faded by time, but the message within carried a weight that could anchor a drifting soul. This wasn't a letter from a lawyer, it was a private bridge built between two people who understood what it meant to be misunderstood by a world that only looked at the surface. The note had been delivered to her hotel room just hours after she walked out of the show, brought by a courier who was told it was of the utmost importance. When Marilyn opened it, her hands still trembling from the ordeal, she didn't find words of pity. Instead, she saw a simple, 12-word sentence written in a strong, elegant hand that she recognized immediately as belonging to someone who had also felt the sting of public judgment. The words were a lifeline. You were a woman of grace tonight. You are enough. Just stay. Those 12 words did what 1,000 therapists and fan letters never could. They validated the person she was trying to become. For years, people wondered where she found the resolve to keep her head high after such a public betrayal of her spirit. They looked for grand explanations, but the truth was much quieter and more sentimental. Every time she felt the world closing in, she would pull that yellowed slip of paper from its hiding place. She would trace the ink with her fingertips, remembering that even on the night she felt most broken, someone had seen the real Marilyn and found her worthy of respect. This note became her most cherished possession, more valuable than the diamonds she wore on screen. It was found by those who organized her belongings after she was no longer with us, placed carefully between the pages of a poem about the resilience of the silver willow tree. When the identity of the sender was eventually whispered, it wasn't a rival, but a woman from an older generation of Hollywood who had once stood in the same line of fire. It was a passing of the torch, a silent vow of sisterhood that whispered, "I see you, and you are not alone." That 12-word note changed everything for her, transforming a moment of public humiliation into a private victory that she carried until her final rest. But the echoes of her walkout did more than just save her own spirit. They started a quiet revolution in the backlots of every major studio. In the next chapter, we explore how one woman's refusal to be a victim gave birth to a legacy of courage that changed the world of cinema forever, proving that the person on the screen was not a piece of property. Why did this single moment in a New York television studio change everything for the future of Hollywood? It was not just because a famous woman had left a stage, but because, for the first time, the world realized that the person on the screen was not a piece of property owned by the public. That night, the invisible wall between the glamorous fantasy and the breathing, feeling human being was shattered for good, and in its place grew a new kind of respect that the industry had spent 40 years trying to avoid. The legacy of that walkout began to ripple through the dressing rooms of every major studio within 24 hours. Actresses who had spent their careers being told to stay silent through the harsh treatment of their superiors suddenly found their own voices echoing Marilyn's quiet strength. They began to realize that if the most famous woman in the world could stand up and say, "No more," then they could too. It was a quiet revolution, fought with the dignified refusal to be treated as a commodity rather than a soul. The era of the all-powerful, predatory host began to wane, as audiences made it clear that they would no longer tolerate the destruction of a person's spirit for the sake of a Tuesday night rating. Marilyn's walkout became a lighthouse for anyone who had ever felt small or discarded by those in power. She had shown that there is a profound power in simply walking away from a table where respect is no longer being served. In the years that followed, the story of the Arthur Vance interview was passed down like a sacred text among performers, a reminder that their humanity was their greatest asset. The industry had to change because the audience had changed. We had seen the real woman behind the platinum curls, and we could never go back to seeing her as just a silver screen dream again. Even today, when we look back at those grainy images, we don't see a victim. We see the birth of the modern woman, a person who understood that her worth was intrinsic and that no amount of fame was worth the loss of her own self-respect. She had traded her seat in the spotlight for a seat at the table of her own life, and in doing so, she gave every one of us the permission to do the same. This wasn't just a moment for Hollywood. It was a moment for every person who has ever had to gather their things and walk out of a room that was designed to break them. The echoes of those clicking heels on the studio floor can still be heard today, a rhythmic reminder that our dignity is the one thing no one can take unless we give it away. In our final chapter, we return to the image of the woman herself, looking past the tragedy to find the enduring smile of a victor who finally found her peace. In the final, golden light of her memory, we no longer see the woman who was cornered on a stage, but the woman who conquered herself. If you close your eyes and picture her now, do not see the tears or the rain-soaked silk of that New York alleyway. Instead, see the quiet, triumphant smile of a person who finally realized she was the hero of her own story. This is the image that remains a woman who walked through a fire of public cruelty and emerged with her soul not only intact, but shimmering with a new and unbreakable light. For those of us who have walked the long path of the decades, we know that life is not measured by the moments when we are celebrated, but by the moments when we refuse to be broken. Marilyn's journey was a mirror for all of us, reflecting the times we had to gather our courage from a hollow place and stand up for our own worth when it was easier to stay seated. She reminded us that being fragile is not the same as being weak, and that a heart that feels deeply is a heart that can change the world. She wasn't just a legend of the silver screen. She was a sister in spirit to every person who has ever felt invisible, every parent who has fought for their child's dignity, and every soul who has dared to dream of a kinder world. The true victory of that night in 1959 was the peace that finally settled in Marilyn's heart. She learned that the only approval she truly needed was the one she gave herself when she looked in the mirror and saw a woman of value. We carry her story with us today because it is a story of hope, a reminder that no matter how dark the room or how harsh the spotlight, our inner light is something that can never be extinguished. She was our platinum angel, a woman who taught us that the most beautiful thing you can wear is your own self-respect, and that the most powerful thing you can say is a quiet, steady no to anything that seeks to diminish your spirit. As we look back at the life of the girl born Norma Jean, let us remember her not for the way her story concluded, but for the way she lived in the middle of it. She was a seeker, a lover of simple kindness, and a woman who chose to be brave when the world wanted her to be a toy. Her legacy is not one of sorrow, but one of radiating warmth that continues to comfort us like a soft blanket on a winter evening. She is finally free from the questions, free from the cameras, and free from the expectations of a world that didn't know how to hold something so precious. Marilyn Monroe left that stage a long time ago, but the courage she found in the shadows remains a beacon for every one of us still finding our way toward the light. If this story touched your heart, ring that notification bell for more journeys into the human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us we are never truly alone. If Marilyn's courage in the face of those cold studio lights touched your heart today, please give this video a like to honor her memory. To join a community that celebrates the real human stories behind Hollywood's greatest legends, Hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for spending these moments with us. And remember, your own light is something no one else can ever truly take away.